Hello, and welcome to Mind Sherlock, where every story feels like a conversation over a warm cup of coffee. Today, I bring you a brand new Sherlock Holmes mystery, filled with twists, clues, and clever deductions. Make yourself comfortable, and let's unravel the case together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in from. Now, let's get started. It was on a particularly dismal October evening in the year 1895 that I found myself once again seated across from Sherlock Holmes in our familiar sitting room at 221B Baker Street. The rain struck the windows with a persistent rattle, and the gaslight above us flickered uncertainly, casting uneven shadows upon the walls. Holmes was in one of his restless moods, that peculiar state of mind which only surfaced when the world failed to present him with a puzzle worthy of his abilities. His long fingers drummed ceaselessly upon the arm of his chair, and his sharp gaze alternated between the fire and the grey sky beyond the glass, as if both might suddenly offer him some hidden clue. In the absence of a case, Holmes drifted from one pastime to another with all the precision of a pendulum. One moment, his violin filled the room with some mournful, minor key improvisation. The next, he was bent over his cluttered work table, coaxing strange blue flames from a retort filled with some vile-smelling concoction. I had long since abandoned any hope of reading my medical journals, for the combination of sound and scent made concentration impossible. At last, Holmes abandoned both pursuits and settled into his chair, hands steepled, eyes half closed, the very picture of intellectual dissatisfaction. It was at that precise moment that a sudden knock, rapid, urgent, and altogether unceremonious, shattered the fragile calm. Holmes's eyes snapped open, and without waiting for Mrs. Hudson's intervention, he sprang to the door himself. The sound alone had been enough to rouse his instincts, for there was in it that peculiar blend of desperation and secrecy, which, in Holmes's experience, only came from a visitor whose affairs were both pressing and perilous. The man who stumbled into our sitting room was a study in nervous eccentricity. His overcoat was stained with mud and worn thin at the elbows. His hands trembled as he removed his hat, and his face, partially obscured by tinted spectacles, glistened with rain and perspiration alike. He lingered awkwardly by the door, as though unsure whether to proceed or retreat. Holmes, however, took only a moment's glance before waving the man forward with an air of quiet authority. Holmes's sharp gaze flicked over our visitor, cataloguing every detail with practiced ease. "A man of government employment," he murmured, "most likely the Foreign Office. Ink on the middle finger of the left hand, and a faint smudge of sealing wax beneath the thumb. You arrived on foot from St. James, but only after disembarking from a cab. Your right shoe bears the unmistakable polish of a cab step, while your left is dulled by pavement grime." The man's jaw fell open in astonishment, and though I had witnessed Holmes perform such feats 100 times before, I could not help but share in his wonder. The man removed his spectacles, revealing pale, anxious eyes. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice unsteady, "before I say another word, I must have your solemn oath that this matter will remain in the strictest confidence." Holmes inclined his head slightly, as if the request were expected, and responded, "I assure you, sir, discretion is the very air I breathe." The man drew a shuddering breath and glanced toward the rain-lashed window, as though expecting to see some unseen pursuer lurking in the mist. Reassured by Holmes's promise, the man finally stepped forward, removing his hat and wringing it between trembling hands. "My name," he began, "is Henry Calder, and I am quite certain that, before this night is over, I shall be dead." "My name," the man stammered, his hands trembling as they wrung the sodden hat, "is Henry Calder. I serve as a senior clerk at the Foreign Office." Holmes offered a faint smile, as though the confirmation were unnecessary. "I have reason to believe," Calder continued, "that my life is in grave danger." His voice faltered, and his gaze flickered once more toward the window. "I come to you not only for your discretion, but because I am quite certain that if I leave this house unprotected, I shall not live to see the morning." Holmes's smile disappeared at once. For a man accustomed to the ordered world of government offices, Mr. Calder was in a pitiable state. His fingers twitched, his breathing quickened, and every word seemed wrenched from him only by force of will. "I am being followed," he said. "Everywhere I go, there is a man, or sometimes two, always at a distance, always just close enough that I can feel their eyes upon me." His gaze darted toward the curtain, as if expecting to see some phantom face peering through. "I saw one of them outside the Foreign Office. Another stood across from my lodgings last night. And when I stepped out of the cab just now, a man in a bowler hat was standing directly beneath your street lamp." Holmes's expression sharpened. "Your life may indeed be at risk," said Holmes, "but I suspect that the danger is not personal, but professional." Calder nodded miserably. "A diplomatic cipher," he said. "It was entrusted to me for secure transfer from our archives to the minister's desk, but when I unlocked the document case, it was gone." Holmes leaned forward, fingers steepled. "Vanished." "Utterly," Calder said. "There was no sign of forced entry, no disturbance, no clue as to how it might have been removed. It was as if the air itself had swallowed it." "And this cipher," Holmes asked, "what was its purpose?" Calder's face grew even paler. "It was used for communications between London and our envoys in the Balkans, a region already teetering on the edge of conflict. In the wrong hands, it could shift the balance of power across half of Europe." "And then," Calder continued, fumbling in his coat pocket, "this arrived at my lodging last night." He handed Holmes a single sheet, folded and creased from anxious handling. Holmes unfolded it with delicate precision. The message, written in a crude, uneven hand, read, "If you go to Sherlock Holmes, you will vanish like the cipher. You have been warned." Holmes studied it briefly before passing it to me. "The threat is unpolished," he said, "but the intention is clear. Someone anticipates your visit, Mr. Calder, and wishes to dissuade you by whatever means necessary." Calder swallowed hard, and Holmes's eyes flicked once more to the window. "The question is not only who wrote this," Holmes said, "but how they knew you would come to me at all." Without rising from his chair, Holmes's gaze swept over Calder like a searchlight. "You wear the uniform of your trade," he said, "though you may not know it. The ink stain on your left middle finger speaks of constant clerical work, but the slight cut across the knuckle is fresh, perhaps from handling a particularly stiff envelope seal this morning." Calder stared at his hand in wonder. "Your coat lining, thin and frayed, suggests a man accustomed to long days in government service, not a dandy who replaces his wardrobe each season. And the mud upon your boots, darker on the left than the right, tells me you exited your cab prematurely, perhaps out of fear, and walked the last stretch to Baker Street through the gutter's edge." Calder's mouth opened in silent astonishment. Holmes allowed himself a small smile. "These are, of course, only the surface details. The deeper ones await discovery." "And the cipher itself," Holmes continued. "You say it related to the Balkans?" Calder nodded. "Yes. Sensitive correspondence regarding alliances, troop movements, and trade agreements." Holmes's fingers tapped lightly against the arm of his chair. "Then it is no ordinary theft. This is not some disgruntled clerk or opportunistic spy. This is a chess move in a game far older than you or I. The Balkans have long been a tinderbox, and whoever controls the information within that cipher holds the match." Watson, who had thus far kept his own counsel, could not help but interject. "Surely, Holmes, you do not mean to suggest that the fate of an entire region rests upon a single document?" Holmes's smile was thin. "I mean to suggest, my dear Watson, that war has begun over less. Mr. Calder, you have stepped into a far larger game than you realize." Holmes's voice had a curious effect on our client. Calder sat stiffly, his gaze shifting between the window, the door, and the flickering fire. It was the look of a man who felt the noose tightening, though whether it belonged to a hangman or some shadowy adversary, he could not yet say. "And you have told me everything?" Holmes asked. Calder hesitated, only for a fraction of a second, but Holmes caught it. "There is nothing else." "Nothing," Calder said too quickly. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "You glance toward the window every 30 seconds, Mr. Calder. That is not the behavior of a man who fears betrayal from within. It is the fear of someone who knows his every step is already observed." Calder's fingers knotted tighter around his hat, and for the first time, I saw real terror in his eyes. Without warning, Calder stood. "I should not have come," he muttered. "I should never have come." Before Holmes could speak, Calder bolted for the door. His hat tumbled from his hand and lay abandoned on the rug. "Mr. Calder!" I called after him, but the front door was already swinging on its hinges, the sound of hurried footsteps fading into the rain. Holmes rose, though with no particular haste, and retrieved the fallen hat. "Curious?" he said softly. "Very curious indeed." Then, turning the hat in his hands, his eyes caught upon something that made him smile in that faint, predatory way I knew all too well. He turned the hat slowly, fingers tracing its inner band. "Watson, do you observe anything peculiar?" I stepped forward, but saw nothing beyond a slightly worn lining. "Enlighten me, Holmes," I said. "The lining," Holmes murmured, "has been tampered with. A crude stitch, hurried by an amateur hand. And here, a trace of sealing wax at the brim, identical to that upon Mr. Calder's fingers." With a deft movement, he loosened the thread, and from the lining, Holmes extracted a small folded paper. "A hidden note?" I asked. Holmes unfolded it carefully. Not a note, a code key. The cipher's key, in fact. Mr. Calder was not only the courier, but the hiding place itself. I stared in astonishment. Then why did he flee? Holmes's smile was thin. "Because someone wished him to believe that speaking to me would be his death sentence. And the most effective lies," he added, "are always built from the truth." The morning after Mr. Calder's sudden flight, I found Holmes seated at our breakfast table, a half-empty teacup balanced precariously on a stack of newspapers. He had consumed neither the eggs nor the toast Mrs. Hudson had prepared, but sat instead with his fingertips pressed together, his gaze far away. "Watson," he said abruptly, "the game is already afoot." "Calder?" I asked, though I scarcely needed to. "Indeed," Holmes replied, "though the man himself is no longer our immediate concern." I had learned through long association not to expect further explanation until Holmes deemed it necessary. I had also learned to consume my breakfast with reasonable haste when such a tone overtook him, for it was a certainty we would not remain long at Baker Street. Before I had taken my second sip of tea, Holmes had risen, donned his coat, and declared that we must retrace Calder's path without delay. Our inquiries began at Calder's lodging house near Westminster, a modest establishment where clerks of the Foreign Office frequently resided. His landlady, a stern woman of advanced years, answered the door herself and regarded Holmes with deep suspicion, as though she feared he had come to collect some unpaid debt. "Mr. Calder?" Holmes asked. "Did he return home last night?" The woman frowned. "Not a sight nor sound of him, sir. He came in after work yesterday, left shortly after supper, and that was the last I saw of him." "Did he mention where he was going?" "Only that he had an appointment with a doctor." Holmes gave a faint smile. "A most unusual physician, no doubt." With Calder having failed to return home, and no further sign of him at the lodging-house, Holmes drew his gloves tighter and muttered, half to himself, "A vanishing act most unconvincing." It was with visible reluctance that Holmes led me toward Scotland Yard, a destination he generally approached with the air of a man being dragged toward a dentist's chair. Inspector Lestrade, though competent in his own limited way, had never quite forgiven Holmes for the innumerable occasions upon which his own conclusions had been publicly overturned. "Calder?" Lestrade repeated, his brow furrowed. Foreign Office clerk, you say? The same, said Holmes. He left our rooms last night in a state of considerable agitation and has not been seen since. Lestrade thumbed through a sheaf of reports on his desk. No complaints filed, no missing persons notices. Which means, Holmes said, either Mr. Calder does not wish to be found, or those who have taken him are confident he will not be missed. Lestrade sighed. I don't suppose you intend to share the nature of his trouble. On the contrary, Holmes said, with a smile so faint it barely existed. I intend to solve his trouble entirely before you have time to misfile your papers. Lestrade snorted, but Holmes was already halfway to the door, his mind leaping far ahead of the yard's plodding machinery. With Lestrade's limited cooperation secured, Holmes arranged for us to visit the Foreign Office under the pretense of inquiring into Calder's professional responsibilities. To my astonishment, this simple request revealed a far broader mystery than I had anticipated. The file clerk, a pale young man with the nervous demeanour of one who had suffered recent reprimands, explained that Calder's disappearance was but the latest in a sequence of troubling events. 3 times in the past month, the clerk whispered, we've discovered evidence of intrusions, cabinets left ajar, documents misplaced, locks forced. And the nature of these documents? Holmes asked. Diplomatic correspondence, said the clerk, all concerning our Balkan envoys. Holmes's eyes sharpened at once. And was Mr. Calder involved in the handling of these files? The clerk hesitated. Well, yes, but only as a courier. Holmes nodded, as though a long-held suspicion had just been confirmed. As we departed the Foreign Office, Holmes remarked, almost casually, You see, Watson, the Foreign Office does not yet know whether Calder is a victim or a traitor. That, my dear fellow, is precisely the kind of ambiguity that makes our profession so invigorating. As we walked back toward Baker Street, Holmes remained unusually quiet, his hands clasped behind his back and his head inclined at a contemplative angle. I had come to recognize this posture as the physical manifestation of deep analytical thought. Watson, he said at last, have you considered the nature of Mr. Calder's fear? Surely it requires little consideration, I replied. The man is plainly terrified. Exactly, said Holmes. Too plainly. I frowned. What do you mean? His trembling hands, his darting eyes, his stammered words, all the hallmarks of fear. And yet, there was something theatrical in his performance. Performance, I exclaimed. Indeed, real fear is erratic, personal. It follows no script. But Calder's anxiety was too methodical, as though rehearsed. Someone taught him how to appear terrified. To what end, I cannot yet say. It was a startling observation, one I might have dismissed as fanciful had it come from anyone else. But Holmes's instincts, sharpened over years of untangling human deceit, rarely led him astray. If his fear was coached, Holmes concluded, then whoever coached him intended that fear to lead him directly to us. Back at Baker Street, Holmes took up Calder's abandoned shoes, which lay where the man had discarded them in his flight. He turned them over with the same reverence one might afford a rare manuscript, examining the soles with particular care. Observe, Watson, he said, passing me one of the shoes. What do you make of this? I saw only mud, a thin, uneven layer of pale brown earth clinging to the edges. He walked through a muddy street, I said. Surely not uncommon in London. Not uncommon, Holmes agreed, but not ordinary either. This is Battersea clay, a distinctive deposit only found near St. James Square, which, as it happens, lies inconveniently far from either Calder's lodgings or his place of work. Then why would he be there? I asked. That, Holmes said, is precisely what we must determine. The ground itself has traced his steps for us. All that remains is to follow. He set down the shoe with a faint smile, as though already savouring the answer that awaited us. It took little inquiry to locate the precise boarding house that lay along Calder's unexplained route. It was a narrow, dreary place tucked into a corner of St. James Square, with a crooked sign swinging on rusted hinges above the door. Holmes knocked briskly, and after some time, the door opened to reveal a landlady of considerable girth and sour temperament. "I've answered to police already," she said without preamble. "We are not the police," Holmes assured her. "We are here regarding Mr. Calder." "Ah," she sniffed. "Him. Nervous as a cat he was. Checked in, checked out, couldn't sit still for 5 minutes." "When did you last see him?" Holmes asked. "Night before last," she said. "Arrived with his collar up and his hat pulled low. Wouldn't say who sent him, but he paid for the room in advance and barely touched the bed." "Did anyone follow him?" I asked. The landlady's face puckered in thought. "Now that you mention it," she said, "there was a man loitering outside the back door. Never came in, just stood there watching." Holmes exchanged a glance with me. "Curious," he murmured. "Most curious indeed." The landlady's description of the mysterious watcher was vivid enough to suggest that he had made a distinct impression, not through any overt action, but through his sheer persistence. "Middle height," she said. "Clean-shaven, though he kept his chin down like a man with something to hide. And his shoes, polished so bright they practically glowed in the gaslight." "Did he speak to anyone?" Holmes asked. "Not a word," she said. "Just stood there, hands in his pockets like he was waiting for something." "Or someone," Holmes corrected softly. "Did he leave any message?" I asked. The landlady shook her head. "But when I went to lock up for the night, I found the back gate ajar, and I swear there were footprints, right there in the dirt, leading up to Calder's window." She crossed her arms. "You ask me. It was no ordinary quarrel. That fellow was watching for his chance, like a cat watching a mouse hole." Holmes tapped a finger against his chin. "A man who does not enter the building, but studies it from the rear, not out of fear, but calculation. This is not the work of a common footpad." As we stepped back into the misty street, Holmes paused, hands clasped behind him, his gaze drifting down the fog-shrouded lane. "There is something familiar in this pattern, Watson," he said quietly. "A touch, a method, a scent of an old adversary. But I cannot yet place the hand." "You think you know the man?" I asked. "Perhaps," Holmes said. "Or perhaps I only know the species." He smiled faintly, though there was no humour in it. "Come, Watson. We must catch up to a shadow before it vanishes entirely." And with that, we plunged once more into the London fog. Night had settled heavily over St. James Square, the fog clinging low to the ground like a living thing. Holmes and I stood in silence across the street from the boarding house where Mr. Calder had last been seen. Holmes had insisted on a personal watch, though I privately doubted whether even his formidable eyes could pierce the mist. "It is not what we see that matters," he murmured, "but what the unseen assumes about us." I confess the remark meant little to me at the time, but I had no opportunity to inquire further. Holmes's attention was wholly fixed on the darkened window of Calder's room. Minutes dragged by with no sign of movement. The house itself seemed to sleep. Yet Holmes's posture, tense, alert, almost predatory, suggested that he detected some presence unseen by ordinary men. "Someone will come," he said softly. "Who, we do not yet know, but it is a certainty they will." I had long ceased questioning Holmes's certainty in such matters. His instincts were rarely wrong. And so we waited, my breath clouding the air, until at last, a figure emerged from the mist, moving swiftly toward the boarding house door. The man who approached was cloaked from head to heel, the collar of his coat turned high and his hat pulled low. His movements were deliberate, almost rehearsed, as though he had played this part many times before. Without hesitation, he slipped into the boarding house, unlocking the front door with a key of his own. "Interesting," Holmes whispered. "A stranger with both key and confidence." We crossed the street swiftly, taking care to muffle our footsteps. Holmes moved like a shadow, noiseless and swift. I, burdened with considerably less grace, nearly stumbled over the curb. "Quiet, Watson," Holmes whispered, though not unkindly. We entered behind the man, Holmes' hand already reaching for the latch of Calder's door. As we crept up the narrow staircase, the man paused outside Calder's room, his ear pressed to the wood, listening intently. Then, in one sudden motion, Holmes struck. His hand closed over the man's shoulder, spinning him round before he could react. The figure recoiled in shock, his hat tumbling to the floor. In the dim gaslight, I saw a face as startled as my own, though Holmes, ever the master of control, simply said, "Good evening." The man staggered back a step, his hand darting toward his coat pocket. Holmes's own hand moved faster, seizing the man's wrist in an iron grip. "I would strongly advise against that," Holmes said softly. The man hesitated, then let his hand fall limp. "Who the devil—" "Sherlock Holmes," said Holmes. "And you, if I am not mistaken, are no common burglar." The man's composure faltered, but only briefly. "I am here on official business," he said stiffly. "Indeed?" Holmes arched an eyebrow. "What curious department of government sends its agents sneaking through boarding houses under cover of darkness?" The man said nothing, but Holmes's grip did not loosen. "You see, Watson," Holmes continued, "this is why I insisted we watch the house. It was never Calder we needed to find, but the man who would come looking for him." Holmes released the man's wrist and gestured toward the stairs. "Let us all return to the street, where we may have a civilized conversation, unless, of course, you wish to complete your burglary first." There was no mistaking the sarcasm, nor the authority in Holmes's tone. The man obeyed without protest. Back on the pavement, the man brushed the dust from his sleeve and straightened his coat. He was younger than I had first thought, though his expression carried the hardened calm of a man used to operating in shadows. "I am employed by the Foreign Office," he said at last. "My orders were to follow Mr. Calder's movements and to report any contact he made with persons of interest." "Persons such as myself?" Holmes asked. The man hesitated. "Your name was mentioned." "Flattering," Holmes said dryly. "And the purpose of this surveillance?" "There are concerns," the man said, choosing his words with caution, "that Mr. Calder may have misplaced his loyalties." Holmes's smile was thin. "And his disappearance?" The agent's brow furrowed. "Disappearance? We have received no word that Calder is missing." Holmes turned to me. "You see, Watson, the Foreign Office casts its nets so widely it no longer knows what it catches." The agent looked alarmed, but Holmes merely tipped his hat. "I suggest you inform your superiors that Mr. Calder is no longer in their keeping, nor in ours. His trail, I fear, has only begun." The Foreign Office agent shifted uncomfortably beneath Holmes's unrelenting gaze. There was no point in further concealment. Holmes had already dismantled whatever shield of secrecy the man had hoped to maintain. "Very well," the agent said with a reluctant sigh. Mr. Calder had been under quiet observation for some weeks. There were irregularities. "What sort of irregularities?" Holmes's tone was casual, but his eyes were hawk-sharp. "Documents entrusted to Calder were known to disappear temporarily, only to resurface under highly suspicious circumstances. Notes that should have gone directly to the minister were delayed or redirected. It suggested," the agent hesitated, "it suggested either gross negligence or intentional tampering." "And yet," Holmes said, "when Mr. Calder vanished from Baker Street last night, the Foreign Office knew nothing of it." "Because his disappearance," the agent admitted, "was not part of our plan. We meant to watch him, not lose him." Holmes gave a faint smile. "Then, my dear sir, you have the rare distinction of investigating a man who has managed to disappear under the very noses of his watchers." The agent's expression was grim. "And now we have no idea who holds him, or why." Without waiting for further conversation, Holmes led the way back into the boarding house. Calder's room, which we had not yet properly examined, lay in precisely the disordered state one might expect from a man who had fled in haste. Papers were scattered across the desk, and a half-packed valise rested atop the bed. Holmes moved through the room like a surgeon at work, precise, methodical, disturbing nothing unnecessarily. His fingers lingered over objects that seemed to me entirely ordinary. A half-burned candle, a pair of mismatched gloves, a collar stud lying on the floor. It was the coat, however, that drew his keenest attention. Hanging over the back of the single chair, it appeared no different from the other garments. Yet Holmes held it up to the light, his fingers tracing the inside lining with delicate precision. "Watson," he murmured, "do you detect anything unusual?" I confessed I did not. Holmes, however, had already produced his penknife and was working carefully at an almost imperceptible seam along the inner breast. A thin smile curled his lips. "Sometimes," he said softly, "the most important secrets are not in the documents, but in the stitching." With the delicate precision of a jeweler extracting a diamond, Holmes worked his knife along the seam. The lining gave way, and from within the hidden fold, he drew out a small metal key, slender and unremarkable to the casual eye. "What is it?" I asked, though even as I spoke, some grim suspicion began to form in my mind. "The cipher key," Holmes said quietly. "The master key used to decode diplomatic communications between London and our envoys abroad. It should never have left the inner vaults of the Foreign Office, yet here it resides, stitched into the lining of Mr. Calder's coat." I stared in astonishment. "Then Calder was either an accomplice or a pawn," Holmes said. "We must determine which." He turned the key over between his fingers, observing every nick and scratch. "The fact that it was hidden so crudely suggests haste. Whoever placed it here had no time for elegance, only urgency." "But if Calder was innocent," I asked, "why not come forward?" Holmes slipped the key into his pocket. "Because fear can be manufactured, Watson, and fear, properly applied, is the most effective silencer of all." The weight of Holmes's words settled heavily upon me. I had trusted Calder's trembling hands and his terrified glances as the genuine symptoms of a hunted man. Yet now, standing in his empty room with the cipher key in Holmes's possession, I could no longer tell if we had been aiding a victim or entertaining a scoundrel. "Holmes," I said, "if Calder carried this key, then at best he is negligent, and at worst, a traitor," Holmes finished calmly. "Yes, Watson, those are indeed the only possibilities." I paced the room, unsettled. "But it makes no sense. If he meant to deliver the key to some foreign agent, why seek your help at all? And if he is innocent, why not defend himself when the opportunity arose?" Holmes settled into the room's solitary chair, steepling his fingers. "Because the truth is rarely so convenient as either option. Calder is a pawn, played upon the board by a hand far cleverer than his own." "But whose hand?" I demanded. Holmes's smile was faint and unsettling. "There are only a few minds in Europe capable of such manipulation, and I fear we are now chasing one of them." As we walked back toward Baker Street, Holmes's silence was almost heavier than his words. It was a silence I had come to associate not with uncertainty, but with recognition. The sense that Holmes was revisiting the archives of his own memory, comparing the present puzzle to some long-buried case. "Watson," he said at last, "consider the sequence of events. Calder's fear, rehearsed, not spontaneous. His appearance at Baker Street, timed too perfectly. His sudden disappearance, too theatrical for mere panic." I frowned. "You mean he was orchestrated?" Holmes said. "Every step from the first knock at our door to his flight into the rain was staged by someone who understands my methods intimately. They knew exactly how I would react." I felt a chill. But who? Holmes did not answer directly. There are few players left who possess that degree of insight into my habits, and fewer still with the audacity to attempt such a performance. His face darkened, and for the first time since the case began, I saw not excitement in his expression, but something close to foreboding. It was a rare thing indeed to see Holmes haunted by the spectre of a past case. Yet as we returned to Baker Street, I could sense that some shadow from his history had risen from its grave to walk alongside us. "There is a certain signature," Holmes said softly, almost to himself. "A flourish at the edges of the forgery, a touch of vanity in the crime itself. This is not merely espionage, Watson. This is personal." "Personal?" I echoed. "There was a case," Holmes said, "long before you and I first met. A clever woman, an actress turned forger, whose talents rivaled even my own. I exposed her, of course, but she disappeared before justice could lay hands upon her." "Surely," I said, "you do not mean—" "I mean," Holmes said, "that some minds do not forgive. They merely wait." He said no more, but the grim curve of his mouth told me all I needed to know. Whoever stood behind the vanishing of Mr. Calder was no ordinary foe. We were walking into the shadow of a mind Holmes had once known all too well. The following morning, as I descended to breakfast, I found Holmes seated at the table, the remains of his meal untouched, his attention fixed upon a slip of paper in his hand. With his other hand, he held the latest edition of the Times, folded to the announcements column. "Observe, Watson," he said, sliding the paper toward me. "You will find a most curious insertion, one which I took the liberty of drafting at daybreak." I leaned forward and read, "To the individual who has taken a personal interest in the affairs of Mr. Henry Calder. All necessary information has been provided to Sherlock Holmes, who now holds the name of the architect behind the cipher theft. Further revelations forthcoming." I looked up, perplexed. "You mean to announce your every step to the criminal?" "Precisely," said Holmes. "It is a principle I have found invaluable. When dealing with an opponent of intelligence, the surest way to flush them into the open is to make them believe they have already lost." "And you expect this notice to summon someone?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Not someone, Watson. I expect it to summon her." The bell rang scarcely 2 hours after the notice appeared in print. Holmes, lounging in his chair with an air of languid amusement, merely raised a finger before Mrs. Hudson had time to ascend the stairs. "She has come," he said softly. A moment later, Mrs. Hudson opened the door, her expression a study in offended dignity, for the visitor had swept past her without waiting for permission to enter. The figure stood framed in our sitting-room doorway, a woman wrapped in a dark travelling cloak, her face hidden beneath a thick veil, her gloved hand resting lightly upon the back of a chair. She neither introduced herself nor removed her veil. Instead, she addressed Holmes directly. "It would seem," she said, her voice rich and theatrical, "that you are not so easily distracted as I had hoped." Holmes rose with a bow, but there was no warmth in his greeting. "I was never one for misdirection," he replied. "Deception, when it is too carefully constructed, leaves its own trail." She gave a soft laugh, low and musical, and I saw Holmes's fingers tighten briefly upon the mantelpiece. There was, I realized, history between them. "Watson," said Holmes, his tone as cool as ever, though his eyes were unusually bright, "allow me to present Miss Adeline Norbury, a woman whose talents for performance and deceit once made her the toast of the London stage, and whose subsequent talents made her considerably more dangerous." The woman gave a graceful nod. "Dr. Watson," she said, "I have read your charming accounts of Mr. Holmes's many triumphs. I hope my modest involvement will prove worthy of your pen." I found myself utterly at a loss, for Holmes had never once mentioned her name in all our years of friendship. "I confess," I said, "I know nothing of Miss Norbury." "No," Holmes said quietly, "because the case in which she first crossed my path was one I chose to forget." There was a silence, and in that silence lay a weight I could not yet understand. "Miss Norbury," Holmes continued, "was once a skilled forger and confidence artist, a woman whose performances extended far beyond the stage. When her talents drew the attention of foreign agents, she found espionage even more profitable than the theatre. You exposed me, she said, but you never caught me. I thought, perhaps, you might appreciate my final bow. Holmes inclined his head. We shall see if it is final, Miss Norbury. Seated between us, Miss Norbury played her role with exquisite charm. She confessed in airy tones that she had merely been assisting an old friend, a diplomatic courier who had become ensnared in affairs far beyond his comprehension. According to her version, Calder had fallen victim to a Balkan blackmailer who had used threats against his family to compel him into removing the cipher key. The theft, she assured us, was a desperate act by a desperate man. Holmes listened with the politeness of a man watching a street magician produce a coin from his sleeve, amused but not deceived. "And the identity of this blackmailer?" he asked. Miss Norbury sighed dramatically. "Alas, I cannot say. The letters came anonymously. My only role was to ensure Calder's safety, which is why I sought to mislead you, Mr. Holmes." Holmes tapped a finger against his knee. "A touching fiction," he said. "Unfortunately, Miss Norbury, it lacks your usual flair." She gave a little shrug, entirely untroubled. "We both know the game, Mr. Holmes. It is only fair that I make you work for your victory." Holmes smiled thinly. "I assure you, Miss Norbury, I intend to." Holmes stood, his gaze fixed upon Miss Norbury, with the kind of detached curiosity a naturalist might show an unfamiliar species. "You orchestrated Calder's disappearance," he said. "Not out of necessity, but as a deliberate sleight of hand, a magician's misdirection." Miss Norbury's smile was faint, but her eyes gleamed with admiration. "I expected no less from you, Mr. Holmes. You ensured his arrival at Baker Street would appear both spontaneous and desperate. You rehearsed his fear, coached his trembling hand, even wrote the anonymous warning he carried." She gave a slight shrug. "What better way to lead you precisely where I wished?" "But why?" I burst out. "What purpose could such a farce serve?" "To waste time, Watson," Holmes said. "Time is the only true currency in a duel of intellects." And while I was occupied chasing ghosts, her accomplice moved freely toward his true objective. Which was the cipher itself, Holmes said. While we examined coats and lodging houses, the real thief moved steadily toward the coast. Miss Norbury's expression never faltered, but her gloved fingers tightened faintly on the arm of her chair. A gesture Holmes, of course, did not miss. "Fortunately," Holmes continued, "I am no stranger to misdirection." He turned to me with that familiar gleam in his eye, the one that always preceded some revelation I had utterly failed to anticipate. "While you and I dutifully followed Miss Norbury's breadcrumb trail," he said, "I took the liberty of sending a telegram to Lestrade. Every major port, railway station and border crossing has been under discreet observation since dawn." "On what suspicion?" I asked. "That Calder was never the target at all," Holmes said. "The true aim was to extract the cipher key, and once that was accomplished, the next logical step would be flight." "Flight to where?" "Somewhere beyond the reach of Scotland Yard, Antwerp, most likely, given its convenience to certain Balkan interests." Miss Norbury's smile remained, but it was tighter now, her eyes flickering to the window for the briefest instant. "Watson," Holmes said softly, "would you be so good as to fetch the Evening Post? I expect Lestrade has already provided our answer." I opened the door, and sure enough, a telegram lay upon the step. Holmes unfolded it with a single flick of his wrist. "Intercepted at Dover," he read. "Perfect timing." The telegram told its tale with clinical brevity. A certain Mr. Alfred Prentice, a Foreign Office clerk with a reputation for bad debts and worse company, had been apprehended at Dover, attempting to board a packet bound for Antwerp. His luggage had been searched, and the evidence found therein left no room for doubt. "Prentice," Holmes said thoughtfully. "A man whose gambling habits were whispered about even in diplomatic circles. A man for whom temptation required little encouragement." "And his connection to Miss Norbury?" I asked. "Elementary," said Holmes. "It was not Prentice who conceived this plot, but Miss Norbury herself. She knew that only a desperate man would dare breach the Foreign Office vaults, and only a man already compromised could be induced to trust her. Miss Norbury offered neither denial nor confirmation, merely studying her gloves with the air of one observing an amusing play from the front row. And so, Holmes concluded, while we pondered Calder's trembling hands, the real traitor quietly boarded a train with his prize. A clever play, Miss Norbury, but you should know by now that I always watch the exits. Her smile, when it came, was full of wicked admiration. Holmes passed me the telegram, allowing me to read the final damning line for myself. Cipher recovered, concealed within false lining of valise. The simplest hiding places, Holmes remarked, are so often the most effective. When a man flees, no one questions the presence of luggage.
Who would think to search it for a document worth half a dozen lives? It was Prentice all along, I said. Calder was nothing more than a decoy, Holmes finished. A nervous distraction to occupy my attention while the real prize slipped quietly away. I shook my head in astonishment. And had Prentice reached Antwerp? Then the cipher would have been in the hands of at least 3 foreign agencies before the week was out, said Holmes. The consequences, both for Calder and for the nation, would have been severe. Miss Norbury rose, adjusting her cloak with languid grace. And all for a piece of paper, she said lightly. No, said Holmes, for the satisfaction of proving, if only for a moment, that you could still outplay me. Her smile sharpened. We both knew how this would end. With the cipher recovered and Prentice under arrest, only one question remained. What of Mr. Calder? Was he complicit in the scheme? I asked Holmes as we walked back to Baker Street that evening. Calder, Holmes said, was precisely what he appeared to be, a terrified man, caught in machinery far too large for him to comprehend. But the cipher key was sewn into his coat. Planted there by Miss Norbury, Holmes replied. She needed him to appear guilty enough to draw my attention, but innocent enough to remain useful as bait. And his fear? Genuine, though its source was not guilt, but helplessness. He knew he was being used, but not by whom. Every step he took, he was watched, guided, and controlled. By the time he came to Baker Street, the only thing left to him was blind panic. I shook my head. A pawn from beginning to end. And the finest pawns, Holmes observed, are those who believe themselves kings. It was a sentiment I could not easily forget. As we reached Baker Street, I could not suppress my admiration. She nearly succeeded, I said. With just a little more luck. With luck, Watson, one can achieve anything, Holmes interrupted. But Miss Norbury's flaw was never luck. It was vanity. Vanity? She did not merely wish to escape with the cipher, Holmes said. She wanted me to know she had done so. She built the case not to avoid my attention, but to demand it. And that was her downfall? Precisely. She could have vanished without a trace, yet instead she left breadcrumbs for me to follow, confident I would be too late. But why such risk? Holmes smiled faintly. Because for a true performer, Watson, there is no thrill without an audience. I could not help but shudder at the thought of such audacity, but Holmes merely lit his pipe. She is the rarest kind of criminal, one who understands not only crime, but the detective himself. I opened my mouth to reply, but at that moment, Mrs. Hudson appeared at the door, bearing a small envelope sealed in deep green wax. Holmes broke the seal, unfolded the note, and read aloud, My dear Mr. Holmes, you were every bit as swift as I remembered, though perhaps a touch less cruel. Our game, I trust, is only beginning. Until next time, A.N. There was neither apology nor bitterness in those lines, only amusement, as if the theft of a state secret was no more than a friendly wager. She will escape justice? I asked. Undoubtedly, Holmes said, but justice is not always the point. And what is? The game itself, Watson. Holmes tapped the ash from his pipe, his expression unreadable. The finest opponents, he said, are not those who fear the law, but those who understand it and choose to dance around it. And with that, the case was closed. The fire crackled cheerfully in the hearth as Holmes stretched his long limbs upon the sofa, the familiar sight bringing a sense of finality to the evening. Outside, the rain pattered faintly against the window pane, and the fog that had haunted our steps all day now coiled about Baker Street like some gray specter reluctant to release its grip. I seated myself in the armchair opposite him, my mind still racing with the events we had just witnessed. "It is a curious sensation," I remarked, "to return to such ordinary surroundings after brushing so close to treason, espionage, and abduction." Holmes, who was in the process of filling his pipe, gave me a faint smile. "You will find, Watson, that the most extraordinary matters often return us to the most familiar places." He struck a match, the brief flare of light illuminating his sharp profile. "And now," he said, "I believe it is time for you to understand precisely how the whole affair unfolded, and how, in the end, it was all visible from the moment our trembling client crossed this very threshold." "Let us begin, as always, with the facts," said Holmes. "Mr. Henry Calder arrives at Baker Street, trembling, disheveled, desperate. He speaks of a vanishing cipher, a shadowy pursuer, and a letter warning that your humble friend Sherlock Holmes is his only hope." He tapped his fingers against the arm of the sofa, his gaze alight with intellectual satisfaction. "And yet," he continued, "from the first, his fear rang false. His trembling was too rehearsed, his narrative too polished. Real terror is chaotic, Watson, while his had the precision of a stage performance." "But why stage it at all?" I asked. "To lure me into the case," said Holmes. "You see, the genius of Miss Norbury lies not merely in her crimes, but in her understanding of her pursuer. She knew no ordinary theft would tempt me, but a story filled with missing ciphers, desperate clerks, and shadowed footsteps was irresistible." He lit his pipe, the smoke curling lazily upward. "Yet, even the cleverest actress cannot erase all traces of reality. And it was from those traces, the mud on his shoes, the sheen on his coat lining, that the true performance began to unravel." Holmes leaned forward, his expression sharpening into the look I knew well, the look of a man unspooling a thread only he could see. "Consider the mud upon Calder's shoes," he said. "A trifling detail, Watson, to the untrained eye, but not to me. Battersea clay, unique to the streets around St. James Square, clung to his heels." "But Calder lived nowhere near St. James Square," I objected. "Precisely," said Holmes. "Yet there it was, a silent witness to his journey. That single smear of clay told me he had passed through a specific district, one of particular interest to our Foreign Service, and one with a particular boarding house that has long been used as a safe haven by operatives of questionable allegiance." He settled back, his hands steepled. "From that mud alone, I knew Calder had been guided there, not by chance, but by design. Someone had chosen the path he walked, ensuring every step led inevitably to our doorstep. I could not help but marvel at the sheer precision of it all. "And you deduced all this," I said, "from a little mud on his shoe." "My dear Watson," Holmes replied, "it is always the ground beneath our feet that tells the truest story." Holmes reached to the side table and produced Calder's coat, which had remained with us after its owner's panicked flight. He held it up, the fabric gleaming faintly in the firelight. "It was this coat," he said, "that sealed the case." I leaned forward, examining it anew, though to my eyes it was merely an ordinary coat, weathered by London rain. "Observe," said Holmes, "the faint bulge at the inner seam, the slightest irregularity, invisible unless one knew where to look." With practiced ease, he drew his penknife and slit the lining, revealing the small metal key we had found earlier, the master cipher key, the very object around which the entire case revolved. "The brilliance of the plan," Holmes said, "was its simplicity. Calder believed himself a man hunted for secrets he might reveal. In truth, the secret was already upon him, concealed in his own coat, placed there by hands far cleverer than his own." "But why not simply steal the cipher directly?" I asked. "Because," said Holmes, "the simplest theft leaves the simplest trail, a theft concealed as a conspiracy. Now that is a work of art." I could only shake my head in admiration at the devious elegance of it all. Holmes leaned back, the smoke from his pipe curling about his head like a wreath. "There was one detail, Watson, that troubled me from the very beginning, Calder's fear. Surely fear is natural under such circumstances, I protested. The man believed his life in danger. Precisely, said Holmes. Yet his fear was too perfect, too carefully distributed across trembling hands, darting eyes, and stammered speech. It was not the raw panic of a hunted man, but a performance. I frowned. But why would anyone coach him to appear afraid? Because nothing attracts my attention so swiftly as a client on the verge of collapse, Holmes said. It is the oldest trick in the book, and one, I regret to say, I should have recognized at once. And the coaching? Textbook work of an actress, Holmes replied. A woman with the skills to shape his very posture and breath, to orchestrate each nervous tick like a line in a script. I felt a chill. You mean Miss Norbury? Who else? Holmes murmured. An actress who exchanged the stage for the shadows, and whose talent for deception is matched only by her audacity. For a moment, Holmes was silent, his gaze fixed somewhere far beyond Baker Street. When he spoke, his voice was softer than usual, almost reflective. There was a case, he said, many years before you and I first crossed paths. It never found its way into your chronicles, Watson, for I saw no honor in recording it. I leaned forward, curious. What happened? A forgery ring, Holmes said, one of rare talent and audacity, capable of imitating the hand of nearly any diplomat in Europe.
At its center stood a young actress, Miss Adeline Norbury, whose flair for transformation allowed her to become governess, secretary, or lady of fashion, as the moment required. And you unmasked her. I did, Holmes said, but not before she slipped through the fingers of Scotland Yard and vanished into the continent. I thought the matter closed, a victory, though not a complete one. It appears, however, that Miss Norbury does not forget. He tapped his pipe thoughtfully. It is a curious sensation, Watson, to find oneself hunted not by a criminal seeking profit, but by an artist craving applause. She wanted the cipher, Holmes said, but that was secondary. The true prize, the real purpose behind this labyrinth, was me. You! I exclaimed. Consider, Holmes said. She could have taken the cipher and disappeared without a trace. Instead, she ensured the theft came draped in melodrama. A trembling clerk, a missing document, a sinister watcher. All bait, my dear Watson, designed to lure me into the center of the web. But why go to such lengths? Because for Miss Norbury, revenge was never enough, said Holmes. She did not want me merely defeated. She wanted me outwitted, ensnared in a puzzle of her own making. And did she succeed? I asked. Holmes gave a thin smile. She came close, dangerously close. The fact that I stand here now explaining the plot is the only measure of my survival. Had her accomplice not been so clumsy at Dover, we might be sitting here still, none the wiser. I shook my head, marveling at the audacity of it all. A woman like that is dangerous. To others, perhaps, Holmes said. To me, she is merely interesting. I paced the room, my thoughts whirring. Then Calder was never the point at all, I said slowly. He was nothing more than the cheese in the trap. Exactly, Holmes said. Calder was chosen because of his fearfulness. His natural nervousness made him the perfect instrument. A man less prone to trembling would have aroused suspicion. But how could she know you would take the case? Holmes smiled. You give me too much credit, Watson. Miss Norbury understood that I cannot resist certain notes. A case involving lost documents, international intrigue, and a client whose manner practically demands deduction. She played me as one plays a violin, and I, like the faithful instrument I am, sang exactly the tune she required. I could not hide my dismay. But Holmes, to think you were manipulated. My dear Watson, he said lightly, if you believe this is the first time, you have greatly overestimated my infallibility. It was not a comforting thought. If a mind like Holmes could be led down the garden path, what hope was there for the rest of us? Fortunately, Holmes added, even the finest puppeteer cannot predict every twitch of the string. With the cipher recovered and the immediate danger averted, I expected Holmes to declare the case closed. Yet as I stirred the fire and glanced at him, I saw none of the usual satisfaction in his face. "We caught Prentice," I said. "The Foreign Office is safe. What more could you want?" "Prentice was a tool," Holmes said quietly. "A blunt instrument used to pry open the vault. The hand that held the tool has slipped away." "But she will make another mistake," I said. "Surely Scotland Yard will watch for her." "Scotland Yard watches for criminals," Holmes said. "Miss Norbury is not merely a criminal, she is a performer. She will return only when the audience is right and the stage properly set." The thought left me profoundly unsettled. It was rare indeed for Holmes's victories to taste so bitter. "We have the cipher," I said, more to reassure myself than him. "The country is safe." "For now," Holmes said. "But in this game, Watson, safety is only ever temporary." It was not the closing line I had hoped for, but I knew better than to expect neat endings when Holmes faced an adversary worthy of the name. Holmes stood, crossing to the window, his gaze fixed upon the street below. "You seem almost amused," I said, unable to contain my bewilderment. "I am," Holmes replied. "It is a rare pleasure to face a mind sharp enough to make me work for my supper." "But she escaped," I protested. "And that," Holmes said, "is why I shall not forget her." There was no bitterness in his voice, only the quiet satisfaction of a chess player who has found his match. "Most criminals," Holmes said, "are tedious creatures of habit. Miss Norbury, for all her wickedness, is an artist." "An artist who means you harm," I reminded him. "Perhaps," Holmes said. "But I have always found that the blade sharpens best against a worthy stone." And with that, he returned to his chair, utterly content. As the fire crackled low and the hour crept toward midnight, Holmes leaned back and regarded me with something approaching fondness. "Every adversary, Watson, is a teacher, some more instructive than others," he said. "And what did Miss Norbury teach you?" I asked. "That vulnerability is not always found in weakness," Holmes said. "Sometimes it lies in certainty." I raised a brow. "Certainty?" "Certainty that no one could manipulate me," Holmes said. "That is why I allowed myself to be led so far into her web. My confidence in my own methods became the very key she used to turn the lock." "And will it change you?" I asked. Holmes smiled. "It will remind me, Watson, that intellect alone is not enough. One must also be willing to entertain the possibility of error." It was, I reflected, perhaps the most profound lesson Holmes had ever admitted to learning, and proof, if any were needed, that even the greatest detective was, in the end, entirely human. As the clock chimed 12, I closed my notebook, knowing this case, though concluded, would haunt Holmes far longer than most. The fire had burned low in the grate, casting faint flickers of gold upon Holmes's sharp profile as he leaned back, eyes half-lidded in thought. I occupied my usual chair opposite him, the comfortable silence between us a testament to the many cases we had concluded together. The storm outside had passed, leaving only the faint drip of water from the eaves, mingling with the quiet crackle of the coals. It was in such moments that I often saw Holmes most clearly, not as the public legend, but as the man whose restless mind could only be stilled, however briefly, by the afterglow of intellectual conquest. Holmes stirred, stretching long fingers toward the fire, his expression unreadable. "Every mind requires a whetstone, Watson," he remarked, almost to himself. "A dull blade cuts nothing, and the sharper the edge, the finer the work." "You mean Miss Norbury?" I said. "Precisely. For all her transgressions, I cannot deny her craftsmanship." There was no trace of bitterness in his voice, only the detached admiration of one artist acknowledging the skill of another. "In her own fashion," Holmes continued, "she has rendered me a service. Complacency, Watson, is the slowest form of defeat, and nothing rouses the mind like a worthy adversary." I could not help but smile at the curious note in his voice. Not fondness, precisely, but something close to it. Holmes, I said. One might almost think you admired her. His only answer was the faintest quirk of his mouth, though he did not deny it outright. For a man who claims no interest in romance, you seem remarkably tolerant of Miss Norbury's flair. Holmes glanced at me, the glint of amusement in his eye unmistakable. Admiration, Watson, is a matter of professional respect. Anything further would be the height of folly. Yet, for all his protest, the idea lingered. Sentiment, Holmes said, with the air of a man pronouncing a particularly unpleasant diagnosis, is the opium of the intellect. Surely a touch of humanity, I began. Humanity, Holmes interrupted, is a splendid quality in moderation. Sentiment, however, is its degenerate cousin, and it blinds even the keenest mind. I shook my head, accustomed to such pronouncements. And yet, I said, there was something in your voice when you spoke of her. Holmes gave a short laugh. The voice of a man who respects a well-played move, nothing more. The heart, Watson, is a trap. No thinking man willingly springs. For a time, we lapsed into silence. I assumed Holmes had returned to his private thoughts about Miss Norbury. But soon I realized his mind had already wandered elsewhere. He reached for the commonplace book that lay beside his chair, leafing through its pages with the air of a man selecting his next meal. There is always another case, he said, almost to himself. The world is not so tidy as to pause for our reflection. Then you are not troubled by her escape? I asked. She escaped this time, Holmes said. There will be others. There are always others. As if to underscore his point, Mrs. Hudson appeared at the door, a telegram balanced upon her silver tray. Holmes took it with a nod, unfolding it swiftly. Well, well, he said, his brows lifting a fraction. A missing pearl and a haunted abbey. It appears the world has already prepared our next diversion. A haunted abbey, I repeated, incredulous. Some clumsy metaphor, no doubt, Holmes said, rising from his chair. Or perhaps, Watson, something infinitely more curious. He handed me the telegram, already reaching for his coat. Will you join me? As if you had to ask, I said. Holmes stood at the door, coat draped across his shoulders, and his hat perched at its customary rakish angle. There was a glint in his eye, that unmistakable gleam that always appeared when the chase was about to begin. We have had our firelight reflections, he said, and now it is time to earn tomorrow's breakfast. I laughed, retrieving my own coat and cane. Do you think Miss Norbury will resurface in this case? I asked. Possibly, Holmes said. Or perhaps someone even more dangerous. He opened the door, and together we stepped into the London night, the game as ever afoot. Holmes stood by the window, his hands clasped behind his back, gazing out at the damp, misty street below. The case had been solved, the cipher recovered, and yet there was a restlessness in his manner, the kind I had seen before, when an adversary had come just close enough to touch his pride. Miss Norbury will slip into the shadows again, Holmes said at last, but she has left behind something far more valuable than a cipher. What is that? I asked. A reminder, Holmes said, turning toward me, that intellect without humility is the surest path to defeat. She understood my methods so well, she nearly became them, a mirror held to my own habits and arrogance. It is not often I find myself playing my own game, Watson, and losing the opening move. I shook my head, amazed as ever by his candour. And yet, I said, you unravelled her web in the end. Holmes gave a faint smile. Did I? She escaped after all, and I have no doubt we shall hear from her again. He took up his pipe, his eyes sharp with renewed anticipation. The best games, my dear Watson, are never truly over. And now, dear readers, I put the question to you. What do you believe was Miss Norbury's greatest mistake? Was it her overconfidence in her ability to outwit Holmes, or was it the single overlooked clue that gave Holmes his first suspicion? Share your deduction in the comments below. If you enjoy unravelling the twists and turns of Sherlock Holmes's most perplexing cases, Be sure to subscribe for more mysteries from Baker Street. And if this tale intrigued you, share it with fellow lovers of classic detective fiction. After all, every great mystery is best enjoyed when solved together. The game, my friends, is ever afoot.